Okay, welcome to the second video on rendering in Maya. So in the first video, we talked about how to render a pass like this. And so in the second video, we're going to start talking about render layers. And so render layers can be useful for a ton of different things. And what we're going to use render layers for is to show how we can create an ambient occlusion pass. And so this is what an ambient occlusion pass typically looks like. It can be really helpful for compositing. You can kind of overlay this on top of your standard render to boost separation between objects, and it's useful for a number of things like that. But we're also going to use it mainly for this video on how we can create a professional looking wireframe that looks something like this. So we're going to create an ambient occlusion pass and then a wireframe pass and then composite them together. And so using render layers is going to be really helpful on that. So we're going to just pick up right where we left off on the last video. So over here, so we're in our render standard view. And so if we move over and look over to this left side of the screen, you should see render setup. If you don't see this, you can also find render setup right here where my cursor is with that button. And so with a standard render, it just renders the scene like that. But we want to start creating some render layers using this box. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to press this plus button to create a new render layer. And I'm just going to call it AO, short for ambient occlusion. And what I need to do is I need to create a collection of objects that I can put into this render layer. And so hypothetically, I could just have like this one tire and have that be the only thing that renders. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to select everything and put it into this render layer. So what I need to do is just right click right where it says AO, and then I'm going to create a collection. And when I create a collection, this will populate with a panel. And so now what I need to do is just, in this case, I'm just going to select everything in my scene. And so I can select like that. I can also just in my outliner, I can just click on the very top thing, scroll down, hold shift, click on the very bottom thing. And we're going to press this button right there. And we're going to add those objects into this render pass. So I'll click that. And so now every object that is selected here is going to render in this ambient occlusion pass. And so now we need to add an ambient occlusion shader onto this render pass. And so I'm going to do that just by where it says collection 1 right there. I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a material override. So I'm going to create a material override, and you can see now this panel shows up. And if I click on this checkerboard button, it's going to bring me to the hypershade where I can now add that ambient occlusion shader onto everything that's in this ambient occlusion render pass. So again, I'm just going to click on that checkerboard. It's going to take me to the short menu on the hypershade. And so I'm just going to go under where it says Arnold and then shader. And then it should be the third from the top. It's called AI ambient occlusion. So I'll click on that and it's going to add an ambient occlusion shader onto everything within this AO render pass. And so it looks like nothing happened over here, right? So the reason for that is we have these two render layers right now. So this is just for the master scene right here. And if I click on this I button, I can only have one I button turned on at a time, but you can see that turns on the visibility of this new render pass that I just created. And so whichever render layer has the I next to it selected, that's which render pass is going to be active within your Maya scene. And these little icons right here with the film buttons, those are when we go to export, what is going to export. So if both of these are selected, then it's going to export both of those render layers when I export. If I just have one, it's just going to render only one. And so let's just check. So let's just make sure that ambient occlusion is turned on, right? So we have that one visible right there. And I'm just going to go up to the top where it says Arnold and then render. And so we can see what our render pass looks like right there. And so you can see I have a black scene behind my model, and so that looks fine to me. If you want this to be more white all around, maybe you could experiment with, creating a plane, and again, by pressing that button right there and adding a plane and putting it in the background and then adding it into your collection. But again, for me, this looks fine. Okay. And so let's go ahead and let's see if we can mess with the shader a little bit. Again, this ambient occlusion looks great to me, but let's just kind of open this up and see how you can change the settings if you want to. So I'm just going to click on the hypershade button, which is right where my cursor is right there. And you can see it created AI ambient occlusion. So that's in my material library. And so I could just click on that. And you can see when I click on that, under the properties panel, my property editor, I have these options show up. So let's see if I can get both of these panels open at the same time. There we go. And so if you want the sample rate to be higher, so 3 is pretty good. Remember, we have the denoiser turned on automatically, so that helps. And if I boost this from 3 to 4, that can help take out just a little bit of the grain that happens. Remember, each time you boost some of these up, it will bring up your render time though, so just keep that in mind. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. By default, it's at 3, the denoiser helps make that work. You might want to take that from 3 to 4. The second thing to kind of mess with is spread. With my ambient occlusion passes, I like the spread to be right at 1. But depending on your project, if you bring that down, you can make the spread a little bit stronger and with a sharper edge the further you bring that down. So just keep in mind that that's an option that's available to you. All right, so let's render this out. So we have our first render layer done. And so let's render this thing. So we're just gonna go to render and then render sequence. And be sure to click on the options box. And you can see by default, it wants to render out of the orthographic back view for some reason. So just make sure that it's rendering out of your camera and make sure that all render enabled layers is turned on. And let's render sequence and close. So I'm gonna render that. And you can see my script editor is kind of updating down there. You can see my render is updating over here. And there we go. Okay, and so let's make sure that exported into my project. So I'm just gonna go to the Finder window. This project's on my desktop, which is a mess right now. And I go under Images. And so whenever you export out of Maya, it's just gonna go into your Images folder. And so you can see with these render layers, it creates this handy little render layer folder. So remember, this is the render that I created in the last demonstration, in the last video. And then this is the render that we just kicked out just now with the ambient occlusion. That looks nice. And so let's move on. So let's create a wireframe render. So we're gonna create another render pass. And it's gonna be really similar to what we just did with the ambient occlusion. So I'm gonna press on this plus button to create a new render layer. I'm gonna type in wireframe. So I'm just gonna name the render layer. And same as before, I'm gonna create a collection of objects, right? So I'm gonna right click where it says wireframe and create a collection. And I'm gonna add whatever object that I wanna render into this render layer. And in this case, I don't think I want a wireframe projected onto my base. I just want it on my car model. So what I can do is I can just kind of select everything in my camera view, just drag and select like that. Make sure it's all selected. I might hold shift and just make sure that those wheels are selected. But I want to deselect just by holding shift and clicking on that base. And just because I don't really want a wireframe projected onto that. So from here, I have what I want selected and ready to go. And now I'm going to add it. So I'll press add right there. And so now in the wireframe, those objects are added into my wireframe render. And so next, what we need to do is create another material override. So I'm just going to right click where it says collection and go down to material, create material override. This new panel will show up. And I'm going to click on this checkerboard. And Arnold has a really handy shader that's called the wireframe shader that we can use. So I'm just going to go under Arnold and then shader, and then scroll down to the second to the bottom where it says AI wireframe. And so now, remember, this eye shows that the ambient occlusion render layer is currently active in my scene. So I'm going to click on that eye for the wireframe to make the wireframe active. And this is going to look a little wrong when I first render this. And so you can see my mesh is super dense in there. And so the reason for that is I have 3 pressed on here. So smoothing is turned on. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag and select everything from my camera view. And then before 3 was pressed so that it's smoothing. So I'm going to press 1 to unsmooth it. So you can see that takes the mesh way down right there. And it looks like, oops, I'm going to delete that. It looks like some plane got created from before. So there we go. I just deleted that to clean that up. And so next up, oh, it's giving me a warning now. That's fun. What is that? Oh, I think that's just from that object getting deleted. And so next up, the wireframe is by default it's in triangle view, and so that's just one last thing that we need to change. And so just the way we changed the ambient occlusion pass before, we're going to change the wireframe. So I'm going to click on the hypershade, which is that button. You can see it created my wireframe shader. And so the first thing I need to do is just under the edge type, I'm going to switch that to polygons, and so that switches it right there from triangles to polygons. And you might want to mess around with changing the line width. So by default, this is what it looks like with the line width at 1. That doesn't look bad. But I could just boost that up a little bit to like 1.5 or something, and that just thickens up the lines. So at this point, we are ready to render. And so far, I've had the alpha channel turned off. I do want the alpha channel turned on here. So be sure when you're rendering your wireframe that the alpha channel is turned on. So remember, we're under the Common tab, under Render Settings. This is a TIFF, and I'm just going to click that so that we're going to have an alpha channel when we export. So let's get ready to export this thing. So I don't need to re-render my ambient occlusion, so I'm just going to turn off that button. And so now when I render, it should only render the wireframe. So let's go same as before. We're going to go to Render, and then Render Sequence. And again, be sure to click on the Options button, Camera, and then in all render enabled layers is turned on. That looks good. And render sequence and close. And so this render is just going to update a little bit. Okay, so there we go. All right, so as a last step, let's composite this in Photoshop. So I am going to go to Finder, and first I'm just going to find these renders that I just created. So under the images folder of my projects, we have the ambient occlusion right there. And then a new folder was created for the wireframe. And you can see it's got an alpha channel because I'm on a Mac and I tapped spacebar, and you can see that's translucent behind it. So that means that there's an alpha channel. So I'm just going to hold Command and select both of those, and I'm going to open them with Photoshop. And so I have my ambient occlusion pass, and then I have my wireframe pass. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate my wireframe and bring it on top of my ambient occlusion. So on my wireframe, I'm just going to right click on this layer and then duplicate layer. And right here under destination, I can either, by default, it's just going to duplicate into the same document, but I can duplicate it and bring it into this next document right there. So I'm just going to click there. And so now I have the wireframe on top of the ambient occlusion. And what I like to do is with this wireframe selected, and I'll just name that real quick, is I'm just going to, where it says normal, I'm going to click here and change the overlay to multiply. And from there, I like to just take the opacity and just bring it down a little bit, you know, so maybe 50%, that looks pretty good. And there we go. So we have the ambient occlusion pass, then we have the wireframe on top of it. And that's how you render out a professional looking wireframe render.